Welcome to the Heaven Speaks broadcast, a space of stillness and presence where we realign with the heartbeat of heaven. Here, you'll be reminded that peace isn't absence, it's presence. Let's begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Heaven Speaks broadcast. I am Trelana, and today we are focusing on rest as rebuilding. When God slows you down on purpose. Can anybody relate to that? I know I can. So why don't we go ahead and get started? There are seasons when slowing down feels unsettling. Not because anything is visibly broken, but because movement has been a part of how we've measured faithfulness. When productivity drops or momentum fades, it's easy to assume we've missed something, or we've fallen behind, or misunderstood God. But Scripture reveals something different. What often feels like delay may actually be rest as rebuilding, a purposeful season where God slows you down to restore what must last. For those who are sincere, committed, and accustomed to showing up consistently, rest can feel confusing. You may still love God, you still want to obey Him, you still feel called, yet something inside has been quieted. The drive that once propelled you forward feels softer. The urgency has lifted, and without realizing it, you begin to wonder if something has gone wrong. But what if nothing is wrong at all? What if the slowing isn't resistance, but redirection? Scripture shows us again and again that God often leads His people into seasons of stillness, not as punishment, but as preparation. These moments are rarely dramatic. They feel ordinary, unremarkable, even inconvenient. Yet they are often the doorway into deeper formation, the kind that cannot happen while you're constantly moving. Before God builds outwardly, He tends to work inwardly. Before He increases influence, He strengthens foundations. And before He sends His people forward, He often slows them down long enough to rebuild what must endure, reminding us that resting in God is sometimes the most faithful response we can offer.
God has always rebuilt people in stillness.
This pattern of rest and rebuilding is not new. It runs quietly through Scripture, woven into the lives of those God trusted with weighty assignments. Ezekiel is a powerful example of this. Again and again, Scripture tells us that the Spirit lifted him and then set him down. At one point, Ezekiel describes being carried to a place of devastation and sitting there overwhelmed and silent.
I sat where they sat and remained there astonished among them 7 days. Ezekiel 3:15.
Before Ezekiel ever spoke on God's behalf, God reformed how he saw. Silence came before speech, stillness before proclamation. God rebuilt Ezekiel's perception so his words would carry weight rather than reaction. Moses followed a similar path. Raised in a palace, educated, capable, and ready to act, he moved too quickly and spent 40 years in obscurity as a shepherd. Now, those years were not wasted. God was dismantling self-reliance and rebuilding humility, patience, and trust. Only after the quiet work was complete did God entrust him with leading a nation. Even Jesus lived this rhythm. 30 years passed in hiddenness before his public ministry began. And once ministry started, he regularly withdrew, even when crowds pressed in and needs surrounded him.
But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Luke 5:16.
Stillness was not an interruption to his mission. It was how he stayed aligned with the Father. And when Elijah, collapsed under exhaustion after great spiritual victory, God did not correct him. He restored him.
Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. Get up and eat, the angel said. 1 Kings 19:5-7.
Before giving Elijah new direction, God rebuilt his strength. God has always rebuilt his servants in stillness. Silence before speech, obscurity before authority, rest before revelation. In each of these stories, we see the same divine pattern. Rest as rebuilding always comes before renewed authority, clarity, or direction.
Not all rest is the same. Understanding what God is doing.
One reason rest feels so disorienting is because we often treat it as a one-size-fits-all. But scripture and experience shows us that God uses different kinds of rest for different purposes. Sometimes God initiates physical rest. The body has carried more than it was meant to sustain, and healing must begin there. Other times, it is emotional rest, when the soul has absorbed grief or responsibility or pressure for too long and needs space to recover. There are seasons of spiritual rest when identity needs recalibration, and God gently reminds us that our worth is not tied to usefulness. In these seasons, God restores intimacy before assignment. At times, rest is directional. God slows movement because a shift is coming, and clarity cannot form in motion. Stillness creates room for discernment, and sometimes rest is deeply protective, a mercy that prevents burnout, disillusionment, or collapse later. Understanding the why behind rest changes how we respond to it. When rest is misunderstood, we resist it. But when rest is recognized as purposeful, we begin to cooperate with it. God does not slow us down arbitrarily. He slows us down precisely to rebuild what will need to last.
What God is actually rebuilding beneath the surface.
When God slows you down, it's rarely because something has gone wrong. More often, it's because something foundational needs attention. Something that speed, productivity, or constant output has quietly bypassed. Rebuilding doesn't happen on the surface, it happens underneath, where roots form, where strength is established, and where future weight will eventually rest. This is the hidden work of rest as rebuilding, not visible at first, but essential for everything that will follow. One of the first things God often rebuilds in seasons of rest is trust. Not the kind of trust that believes God can do something, but the deeper trust that believes He is still at work even when nothing appears to be moving. When productivity is removed, trust is revealed. Rest invites us to depend on God without the reassurance of visible results. Alongside trust, God frequently rebuilds identity. Many of us don't realize how much our sense of worth has become tied to usefulness until usefulness is actually taken away. Rest gently exposes the places where we've measured our value by output, service, or momentum. In slowing us down, God reminds us that we are loved sons and daughters before we were ever workers in His kingdom. Discernment is another quiet work of rebuilding that happens beneath the surface. Noise, urgency, and constant engagement, they dull our spiritual sensitivity over time. Stillness sharpens it. In rest, distractions fall away and clarity begins to return. We start to recognize God's voice again, not because He has started speaking, but because we finally slowed down enough to listen. God also rebuilds desire during these seasons. Striving has a way of turning obedience into obligation. Rest allows desire to be purified, where following God is no longer driven by pressure or fear or expectation, but by genuine love and alignment. What once felt heavy begins to feel holy again. And finally, God rebuilds capacity. Just as a structure must have strong foundation to bear weight, our inner life must be strengthened to carry future assignments. Without rebuilding, expansion would crush us. Rest prepares us to hold more responsibility, more influence, more fruit, without breaking under the weight of it. This is why rest can feel so disorienting. You don't see immediate change because the work is happening at the deepest level of your being. But nothing is being wasted. God is restoring what will sustain you later. What feels like pause is often preparation. What feels like stillness is often strengthening. And what feels unseen is often the most important work of all.
Why rest feels so uncomfortable.
If rest were easy, we wouldn't resist it so fiercely. For many people, discomfort doesn't come from slowing down itself, but it comes from what slowing down exposes. When activity quiets, the inner narratives we've learned to outrun suddenly become audible. Yeah, fear surfaces. Those questions rise. Old measures of worth feel unstable. And without realizing it, we begin to associate rest with loss rather than safety. One of the most common fears beneath resistance to rest is the fear of losing momentum. We worry that if we stop, everything we've built will slip away. Progress feels fragile. Influence feels temporary. We've learned to believe that constant motion is what keeps things alive, but God is not sustained by our pace. What He builds does not depend on our striving to survive. Another fear that often emerges is the fear of being forgotten. Stillness can feel like invisibility. When output slows, affirmation often does too, and that absence can be unsettling. Rest presses on the question many of us avoid: who am I when no one is watching? God uses these seasons to root our identity more deeply in His presence than in recognition. There's also the fear that rest might last forever, that this pause has no clear endpoint. When we don't understand the timeline, stillness can feel unsafe. But God does not slow us down to abandon us. He slows us down to protect us from moving forward without what will need to remain whole. Often, rest confronts a quieter fear as well: the fear of losing control. Activity gives us the illusion of agency. We feel involved, necessary, useful even. Rest requires surrender, trusting God to work without our constant participation. That kind of trust doesn't come naturally. It has to be learned. And beneath all of it is a deeper question God gently brings to the surface. What have you been depending on instead of me? Not to condemn you, but to heal you. This is why rest feels so vulnerable. It removes the scaffolding we've leaned on and invites us to anchor ourselves more fully in God Himself, trusting God's timing instead of managing outcomes. Resistance doesn't mean you're failing the season. It means that God is touching something important. Rest feels uncomfortable because it asks us to trust God in ways productivity never did. And yet, it is often here in the quiet, the waiting, the slowing, that our faith matures from belief into deep reliance.
Rest versus giving up, a critical distinction.
One of the greatest dangers in seasons of slowing down is misunderstanding what God is asking of us. Without clarity, rest can be mistaken for passivity, and obedience can feel like disengagement. But rest and giving up are not the same thing, even though they can look similar on the surface. Giving up flows from despair. It carries resignation, numbness, or withdrawal. It often says, "What's the point?" and disconnects from hope. Rest, on the other hand, flows from trust. It says, "I don't understand the season, but I trust the one leading me through it." Rest does not abandon faith, it deepens it. So when God invites rest, He's not asking you to stop caring or to disengage from your calling. He's inviting you to stop striving in your own strength. Rest is an active posture of surrender, not a retreat from responsibility. It is alignment with heaven's pace rather than resistance to it. Scripture makes this distinction clear. God does not call His people to collapse into inactivity, but to wait with expectation.
Those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Isaiah 40:31.
Waiting here is not stagnation, it is renewal. Strength is being restored so movement can resume without collapse. Likewise, when God calls us to stillness, it is never to diminish us, it is to re-anchor us.
Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10.
Stillness is not disengagement, it is recognition. It is the act of recentering our awareness on who God is and where our security truly comes from. Giving up pulls away from God, but rest leans more deeply into Him. This distinction matters because many people prematurely fight rest, fearing it means losing ground. But when rest is God-led, it is not a pause in progress, it is a progress happening at a deeper level. What looks like inactivity externally is often intense alignment internally. If God has called you to rest, you are not failing. You are not drifting. You are not falling behind. You are choosing trust over control. And that choice is never passive.
How to cooperate with rebuilding.
Once we understand that rest is not failure and slowing down is not abandonment, the next question naturally arises: how do I move through this season well? Not how to rush it, but how to cooperate with what God is rebuilding beneath the surface. Well, the first way we cooperate is by agreeing with the season instead of resisting it. Resistance often looks spiritual on the outside. We're pushing harder, we're doing more, we're praying louder. But internally, it's driven by fear. Agreement sounds quieter. It says, "God, I don't fully understand this, but I trust that you do." That posture alone releases tension and allows restoration to begin. Another key form of cooperation is gentleness towards yourself. God's rebuilding process is patient. When we judge ourselves harshly for resting or for slowing down or needing recovery, we work against the very healing God is offering. Scripture reminds us that God does not drive His people harshly. He leads them with care. Cooperating with rest often means learning to extend to yourself the same grace that God has already given. It's also important to release comparison during the season. Watching others move, build, and advance while you feel paused can stir unnecessary pressure. But comparison blinds us to what God is doing uniquely in our lives. Rebuilding requires focus, and comparison constantly pulls attention outward instead of inward, away from the quiet work that God is doing. At the same time, Cooperation doesn't mean total disengagement. Rest does not require you to shut down your heart or stop listening for God's voice. It simply shifts the emphasis from output to attentiveness. You stay connected without forcing direction. You remain available without demanding answers. This posture keeps your spirit responsive while your soul recovers. Finally, one of the most important ways to cooperate with rebuilding is to resist the urge to manufacture fruit. Striving to produce visible results prematurely can delay the very growth that God is establishing. Just as roots grow best when left undisturbed, spiritual rebuilding often requires trust that unseen work is enough for now. Cooperation looks like humility. It looks like patience. It looks like letting God set the pace. When you stop fighting the process, rebuilding accelerates naturally. What God is restoring will emerge in its time, stronger, steadier, and able to last.
Trusting God's timing while you are still.
One of the hardest parts when God slows you down is not knowing how long the season will last. Our minds search for timelines and milestones and signals that movement is about to resume. But God's timing is not driven by urgency. It is governed by wisdom. Stillness teaches us something speed never could: how to trust God without needing advance notice. When we are forced to release control over the schedule, we learn to recognize God as faithful apart from outcomes. This is where trust matures, not because answers are given, but because dependence deepens. Throughout Scripture, God's timing rarely aligns with human expectations. He is never early, never late, and never careless. When God slows us down, it is not because He is uncertain, it is because He is precise. He sees what we cannot yet see, including what would collapse if released too soon. Jesus lived fully submitted to this pace. He was never hurried by need, pressure, or demand. Even when urgency surrounded him, he moved with peace and clarity and purpose. His life reminds us that alignment with God's timing produces authority, not delay. Trusting God while you are still does not mean doing nothing. It means allowing faith to replace force, patience to replace pressure, and peace to replace anxiety. It is learning to stand securely without needing to rush ahead of God.
Let rest complete its work.
If God has slowed you down, it is not an interruption. It is an invitation into rest as rebuilding. An invitation to heal what has been strained, to strengthen what has been carrying too much, to rebuild what must last beyond this season. Rest is not something to endure until real life resumes. It is the work of this season. And like all of God's work, it is purposeful, it is intentional, and rooted in love. You do not need to hurry this process. You do not need to explain it. You do not need to measure it against anyone else's pace. What God is rebuilding in you will support what He releases through you later. Let rest finish what striving could not. Let God establish what cannot be shaken. And trust that when movement returns, you will rise with greater clarity, deeper strength, and lasting peace. I have a declaration for you. I receive rest as God's rebuilding work in my life. I release the pressure to keep moving when God is inviting me to be still. I trust that what He is forming beneath the surface will sustain what He releases in the open. I am not behind. I am not forgotten. I am not failing. I am being strengthened, restored, and reestablished in His care. I trust God's timing, His wisdom, and His love for me, even when the work is unseen. Heaven is still speaking. May His peace surround you and His presence go with you. Explore more at heavenspeaks.co. Until next time, stay aligned with His voice.